the Amari Cooper to Buffalo trade. The very interesting development for me with this, how does this affect the Cleveland Browns? And this is the thing that's very important with these trades in fantasy, is really to pay attention to the opportunities that the team losing the star player will get.
And Jameis Winston has nowhere to go.
Winston high, back of the end zone, it is caught, touchdown!
What a catch.
And that's going to breathe a little life into Cleveland.
Yeah, what a catch.
Njoku.
Winston going for it all for the end zone for Tillman. He's got it!
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Fantasy Football 201. In today's video, we're going to react to the NFL trade deadline from today. I'm going to review all the moves that were made today and how they are fantasy relevant. Key information that you need to take from these trades today that can help you win a fantasy football championship and close the stretch run with some sleeper names. So not a lot of big time names were moved. Maybe a little bit of a disappointing deadline for some. But this does open up some interesting opportunities for some players and some units in terms of the defenses to keep an eye on that could really help you rest of season. So if you're interested in more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. I reply to all my commenters. So if you have any questions about your team, comment below, and your questions will be featured in my show that comes out over the weekend in the fan mailbag in preparation for the Sunday game. So please take advantage of that and subscribe to this channel. All right, so first, before we get into the moves today, the four biggest deals that we're all pretty much familiar with at this point were the four wide receivers that moved. Davante Adams traded to the Jets, Amari Cooper traded to the Bills, DeAndre Hopkins traded to the Chiefs, and then Diontae Johnson traded to the Ravens. So those were the four biggest moves that were all made prior to today. And it's crazy because DeAndre Hopkins may have been the guy that everybody was least expecting to be a big impact player on the move. And yet the Kansas City Chiefs of all teams, this front office, man, they just never seem to make mistakes anymore. And they may have gotten the most impactful wide receiver rest of the season in fantasy of all these guys. So props to them. DeAndre Hopkins looked great last night against the Bucs, and he should be a solid wide receiver, at least a wide receiver 3, depending on the matchup rest of season, and a very strong start consideration weekly rest of season as well. But aside the point, these four moves have all kind of been talked about and have been relevant for quite some time, so I won't really focus as much on these as much as the moves that were made today. I do have an instant reaction to the Cooper and Adams trades that were made earlier, so you can check that out on my channel. And if you watch my intro video, you could see that the biggest benefactors of that were some Cleveland Browns who were very successful in the last couple weeks. So keep an eye out not only for these teams receiving the players, but the teams giving up, because that opens up opportunity for some other guys to step in and become fantasy sleepers. So we'll look at the moves made today, and I'll first go through the offensive positions, and then we'll get into the defensive moves that were made today, because I think this is important for your DST streamers and some matchups that come about in the playoffs. All right, so no quarterback moves made today. I just want to comment on this real quick. There was a lot of buzz a couple weeks ago about Stafford being traded for Darnold. And I just find that stuff to be absurd, man, because the quarterbacks, their job the entire offseason is to learn the playbook and to, adapt, make sure that they know that their team situation. These guys spend all offseason preparing. So when you put them in a situation that they have to adapt last minute, it's very hard for the team. We saw this with Josh Dobbs. He was successful at first, but then after he was acclimated for a couple days, he got exposed. It just takes a long time to learn the playbook. And honestly, quarterback trades mid-season are pretty rare to just not going to happen at all. There are some exceptions like we saw last year, but for the most part, you can't really count on any fantasy quarterback trades being relevant for the most part. All right, so one running back move made today, but this one is actually pretty important in my opinion. Khalil Herbert, who was traded from the Chicago Bears to the Cincinnati Bengals. So we'll look at the pick compensation real quick. I believe that Chicago, they received a 7th round pick from the Bengals for Herbert. So I think it's a good trade for both sides because the news that came out from Cincinnati is that Zach Moss has a neck injury and he's out for the season. So huge news for those Chase Brown managers because now Chase Brown is a must start every week. I think he's a running back 2 to end the season. And I was high on him all offseason because I felt that he was the more talented back. Now he's got a full workload. So is this addition of Khalil Herbert to Cincinnati going to cut into Chase Brown's workload? And in my opinion, I don't think that it will. I think that what you're going to see is potentially a 70-30 split at best where Brown gets 70% of the carries and then Herbert gets 30. But all that being said, this does make Khalil Herbert now a fantasy relevant player, which he was not in that Chicago backfield situation. So if you own Chase Brown and you're in a deep league, like an 18-team league, 16 even, Khalil Herbert is a must roster player because if anything happens to Chase Brown, now Khalil Herbert becomes a starter on a Cincinnati Bengals offense that is starting to find its rhythm and has been pretty successful the last few weeks. So Chase Brown obviously really benefits mostly from the Moss news and now the fact that he's the clear RB1 that knows the system. But Herbert is somebody to monitor because if any injury does happen to Brown, he becomes a potential lottery ticket for you. For Chicago, this to me is very interesting for Roschon Johnson's dynasty value long term. So, I mean, DeAndre Swift, a veteran, you don't really know how many years he's going to be in Chicago, but Roschon Johnson has looked good from time to time. And I think ultimately what Chicago is going to do is try to upgrade the running back room through the draft eventually, sometime within the next 2 years. I wouldn't be surprised if they do that, build around Caleb Williams. But Roschon Johnson, the younger running back compared to Swift and the more likely to be on the team long term, this is good for his fantasy value, especially in Dynasty. And again, if anything happens to Swift, now he doesn't have the competition with Herbert. So just consider that with those two backups. They're lightly rostered and probably won't really be relevant until an injury happens, but still a very important deal for your fringe running backs on your roster. All right, so this trade, man, I know you guys know what I'm about to talk about, but why would Dallas trade a 4th round pick for Jonathan Mingo? That to me was just baffling of a trade. I mean, they've already given up a 4th round pick for Trey Lance, which that's backfired. And I saw somewhere today that what they gave up to get Jonathan Mingo was more than they received for Amari Cooper in a trade. So just terrible management of assets. I feel like this screams desperate from Jerry Jones. And props to David Tepper, Dan Morgan, and the Carolina Panthers. This might be one of their best trades that they've ever made since Tepper bought the team. Because Dallas it's looking like they're going to be a top 10 drafting team, and you're getting a 4th round pick from this. Just they fleeced Dallas. So what does this mean for Jonathan Mingo? To me, I would be interested in this trade if Dak was still healthy, but it looks like he's going to be out for some time, and CeeDee Lamb is going to be out too. So Mingo is going to take some time to learn the playbook, and I think if you're in the deepest of leagues, he would be worth rostering to just see what happens. I mean, if anything, I think he's more of a trade away candidate if you happen to have him in those deep dynasty leagues because people, the Dallas Cowboys media and everything, somebody may buy into this hype. But I think more than likely what you're going to see is he's going to be mixed in with these guys like, Keontae Turpin, the guys that are in the Brooks, the rookie, like guys like that are just within the fringe of playing. And because Mingo has not been a very good wide receiver with Carolina. So I don't really think that this really helps Mingo's stock. And I'm not really sure it really helps the other guys' stocks as well. Because, now what happens to Tolbert if Lamb misses time? Is he going to lose out on some targets? It's just it just does not make any sense to me from Dallas's perspective why they would make this trade. But yeah, Stephen A is going to have a field day with them about this, I imagine. But the more relevant news that not many people are really talking about from this is what you get from the Carolina receivers. So I've been talking about Xavier Legette. I mentioned him over the past couple weeks about how if Diontae Johnson gets traded, this leads to more targets from Legette. And he benefited from that this past week. He caught a touchdown. He could have had more points, but he dropped another long pass. The point is that now Legette, with Mingo leaving, is going to get even more targets because the competition he has is Adam Thielen, who's old and dealing with injuries, Coker, who is unproven, and then JaTavion Sanders, who's a rookie tight end as well. So Carolina, they're just starting from scratch. They're trying to collect draft picks, which is what they should be doing. But I'm very interested in Xavier Legette as somebody that must be rostered and honestly could be a great sleeper rest of season. This news just helps his stock even more. I think Legette, if he's out there on waivers and you can get him, I would definitely do that this week because I think that there's potential that he could really take off in the second half of the season. I'd like this for Coker as well, who's going to be either the second or third wide receiver, depending on what happens with Thielen. But I think that for both him and Adam Thielen, it's really I'm not sure what kind of elite ceiling you're going to get. Whereas with Legette, this guy is uber talented. He makes a lot of mistakes still, as you've seen with some of his drops that he's made so far this season. But just so much talent, and I think that that's the building block for this offense is to build around him, Bryce Young, and then maybe Jonathan Brooks and Chuba Hubbard, depending on what your opinion on them is. And then keep an eye on JaTavion Sanders too. He could benefit from this as well. Had some up and down performances this season, but as a whole, he's getting more targets as the season goes along. So if you're really hurting for tight ends and you're not able to get Gesicki or one of these other deep waiver guys and your team is hurting for one, keep an eye out for JaTavion Sanders because he could become more relevant too as the season progresses. Another trade I want to talk about at wide receiver is Mike Williams to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I'll going to double check what Pittsburgh compensation, or I guess what the Jets compensation was, a 5th round pick. That's pretty good for New York to be able to get that from Mike Williams. But I like this move for Pittsburgh. I think that this is going to just make things better for George Pickens as well. Obviously, Mike Williams now is going to be the number 2 receiver, get some more playing time. I'm not a big fan of him as a fantasy receiver because he's very much a X receiver that is just dependent on long bomb throws and touchdowns. But I think this actually could help George Pickens because there's a lot of times where he's forced into that role, whereas now maybe they can kind of utilize him more in the slot, move him around a little bit, take some of the defensive pressure off of him because he was getting a lot of hyper focuses from defense because they're clearly their best player. Now they can kind of spread things out a little bit. So plus for Russell Wilson too, I think this definitely helps his fantasy value to just get another guy in the room that's a veteran, capable wide receiver in this league. It's a little bit negative though for those deep league guys that have Calvin Austin, who had a great game prior to their bye week. I'm suspecting that he's going to get some decreases in targets after this. And then Pat Freiermuth, who's already kind of fallen off the fantasy radar this season anyway, this just continues to hurt his stock. Among the Jets, so Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson, those guys are already getting a lot of targets from Aaron Rodgers. So this does not really impact them as much as it does a guy like Allen Lazard. Lazard has actually been a solid fantasy receiver, not consistent, but as a whole, he's had some good games. And I think now that they've cleared out Mike Williams, this puts Lazard clearly in the driver's seat for the 3rd wide receiver on this team. And he's already had rapport with Aaron Rodgers in the past. So all this adds up to, now Lazard is in that rosterable tier where you can kind of see what happens. I don't love him, but obviously, as we've talked about many times, keep an eye out for injuries because he's got that previous rapport with Aaron Rodgers. And if anything happens to Davante Adams or Garrett Wilson, then Lazard becomes very interesting too. And then Tyler Conklin, I think, potentially benefits as well. He's, again, among those tight end guys on the fringe that you stream. But, just losing out on the Mike Williams targets could help Conklin in that range in the middle of the field, too, for those possession receptions that they need. No tight end trades from today, but a lot of defensive trades. So we'll talk some of the big defensive moves that were made. The biggest one to me is Za'Darius Smith going to the Detroit Lions from Cleveland. So Detroit, they needed somebody to replace Aiden Hutchinson after he broke his leg, unfortunately. And Za'Darius Smith is a great defensive end who's going to come in right away. And for this unit in Detroit that already is looking excellent, they just get another pass rusher. So makes these matchups for teams playing Detroit more formidable. I think if you have the Detroit defense, you feel more confident now with them. And if they're out there for whatever reason, I think they've become a team that you want to grab even more. So what does this mean? I think for the NFC North teams that have to play him later this season, and the Lions, I think this just makes things tougher for them. So, and we'll kind of go into a little more depth of the playoff matchups with these defenses. Probably next week is when I'll drop a video that's talking about playoff strategy and looking ahead at the matchups. But Detroit, this is definitely a plus up for their defense. And then I want to highlight Cleveland as well, because Cleveland had a reputation last year of being one of the best fantasy defenses, and rightfully so. They were amazing last year, but this season, definitely a lot different. Now that you lose Smith, you're going to have more of these offensive lines focusing around Myles Garrett. So what this does is this is just going to make their pass defense, which has already been underratedly bad. That's part of why Quentin Johnson had such an amazing game this past week. It's just going to make Cleveland even worse of a defense, especially in the passing game. So now they become a team that you're going to be targeting late in the season in terms of pass catchers, because it's their defense definitely got a lot worse with Za'Darius Smith leaving. And then how about the Washington Commanders getting Marshon Lattimore? They gave up a lot to get him. They gave up, I believe, a third, a fourth, and a fifth for this upcoming draft. But you're getting a Pro Bowl caliber cornerback, and this has kind of been one of the weak points of this team, is just having a defensive back who can lock up guys. So this is a great move for Washington. And, I've been talking about this as well with their defense, is that they've been one of the more underrated defensive turnarounds. They came into this season with a reputation of being one of the worst defenses in the league, but they've slowly turned things on. Dan Quinn's defensive coach, he's really doing a great job putting this defense together and coaching them up to be a great unit. And now they get Lattimore, so that's just going to make everybody else more successful at what they do, take some of the pressure off them. I think this really pluses up Washington's defense. And, just keep an eye out for that, because, for the Eagles still have to play Washington twice this season. So, we'll see what happens with A.J. Brown, but just keep in mind that A.J. Brown now is going to potentially draw Marshon Lattimore in 2 games to close this fantasy playoffs or fantasy football season. So I'm not saying to trade A.J. Brown or anything, but just keep that in mind, that Washington is going to be a tougher defensive unit to face now, and they've already been playing a lot better as of the last month. And then New Orleans, very much, not as much to the degree of Cleveland, but they've had some good defensive players through the years and have developed a reputation of being a good defense. But the numbers speak for itself the last several weeks during their losing streak. They are getting worse and worse and worse, and they let Bryce Young come back on them this last week for a victory. So New Orleans Saints defense, this is now becoming a defense that you want to target as well. Baltimore gets Tre'Davious White from the Los Angeles Rams. So this is another good trade that I like for Baltimore. They've made some very good trades for their team. Not really as much for fantasy. I'm not a fan of the Diontae Johnson trade in terms of fantasy value, but just in terms of the overall football team, they're making some very good moves, and they only gave up a 7th round pick to get him. So so great move for Baltimore. I think this helps their defense, but I don't think it turns them into a juggernaut necessarily. But just it makes them, more formidable when they get to the playoffs, getting some of the pieces that they need to feel their Achilles heel, to address their Achilles heel. Sorry. But the bigger move to me is the Rams have already been a pretty bad pass defense this season. There's been multiple matchups this season. Just look at this past week at JSN. Marvin Harrison had an amazing week 2 against this Rams defense. Just go back and you can see that this defense has given up a lot of points to the receivers. And next week they're getting the Miami Dolphins. So what this means to me that if you've got like somebody on your radar like Tyreek Hill, he is a must trade for this week. He struggled with Tua, but he gets the Rams this week and then he gets the Raiders this next week. And then they still, I believe, have to play the Cleveland Browns at some point this season. I may be wrong about that. But just with this matchup coming up against the Rams, I'm suspecting that he will go off. So he is a great trade target, especially with White being shipped off to the Ravens. And then there are 3 other defensive trades that I don't think are as fantasy relevant, but they do make some of these teams interesting. Preston Smith going to the Steelers. I don't think this really impacts Green Bay's defense. I think they're just doing this as a financial move to get a draft pick. But for Pittsburgh, they're already a great defense, and I think they will continue to be great, especially now that they have added Preston Smith. Arizona added Browning from Denver. And very much the same way, I don't think that this really changes Denver's outlook as a defense, Baron Browning. But for Arizona, I think this is relevant in that, we think of Arizona as this pushover defense that has, is just consistently a sieve that you can rely on for fantasy. But actually this year they've been a much better defensive team, and they're kind of becoming more of a running identity team as well. So just keep that in mind with Arizona, is that I think that they are getting better, and they may be a team that you might not want to just approach as a must-play defense for whoever is playing against them. And then Khalil Davis of the Houston Texans was traded to the 49ers for a 7th round pick. And I don't think this really has a huge impact on either defense, but it does for the 49ers make them a little bit better than they performed. I still like the 49ers as a defense that you can roster, but I don't think that this changes Houston's outlook as a good defense. So we will close things out by talking about the biggest fantasy winners and losers from deals that were not made on these teams. I'm going to go through positions on this. So let's start with the biggest winners from the trade deadline of moves that did not happen. To me, the biggest quarterback winners are Matt Stafford and Geno Smith, and that is because their lead receivers were not shipped off. There were rumors that Cooper Kupp would be traded. There were rumors that DK Metcalf could be traded, but neither of them did. So both these quarterbacks are winners to me because they've kept all their receivers. They still have great targets. Ultimately, both these guys are really on the fringe of guys that you want to start, and they're best in streaming matchups only. But still, this does not, by not trading away their elite receivers, it gives them still fantasy relevance. I think if the Rams were to lose Cooper Kupp, that would significantly hurt Stafford's value. So to me, they are both winners from this trade deadline. My running back winner from this trade deadline is Rico Dowdle, because I think if anything, the move that Dallas should have been making is trying to get Chuba Hubbard from the Panthers. I think that would make sense for a 4th round pick. But then they get Jonathan Mingo, which to me, it just does not make any sense. It's just like, I still do not understand why they made that trade. But anyway, but what this does, but the fact that Dallas did not add a running back, is this basically makes Rico Dowdle a clear lead running back on this team rest of the way. I think there were a lot of doubts with him just because we didn't know if Dallas was going to add somebody. Could Dalvin Cook be effective again, Zeke Elliott? But no, the answer is Rico Dowdle. And I think that especially now that you've lost CeeDee Lamb, he may miss some time. Cooper Rush is a little more limited of a passer than Dak Prescott, so you may see more dump offs to the running back. I think this just sets up Rico Dowdle to be a very effective running back play in fantasy, and one that if you're not already rostering him, then you should, for one, and then two, it puts him into a category where I would not be surprised if he becomes a must-start player at some point by the end of the season. The wide receiver winners that did not move at this trade deadline, or that were winners because moves were not made at this trade deadline, is Jacoby Myers and Terry McLaurin. So starting with Myers, I think if there was a wide receiver that could go next, realistically among the, we had those 4 guys that I mentioned earlier that were already traded away. But Jacoby Myers being on the Raiders to me kind of did not make sense. I think that he could be effective somewhere else for a contending team that needs a receiver, like Dallas. Why did they not go after him? I don't know. But anyway, Jacoby Myers not moving teams. This puts him in a position to now be the lead wide receiver for the Raiders the rest of the way. And, they got quarterback problems. They also have Brock Bowers. But Jacoby Myers still remains relevant in fantasy. And I think if something were to happen, like, if he went to the Ravens like Diontae Johnson, then that would kill his value. But now Jacoby Myers is going to stay relevant in fantasy, which is good for people that own him. And then Terry McLaurin, kind of the opposite deal. I think Washington could have been in the market for a wide receiver. And if they got, one of these elite guys like Cooper Kupp or DK Metcalf, then now we would start to have concerns about Terry McLaurin. But now that they did not trade for any receivers, Terry McLaurin is going to be locked in as a wide receiver one the rest of the season. To me, I think that he's clearly in the top 15, and he has upside to be even higher than that rest of the season. So this is great for the Terry McLaurin owners based on this trade deadline too. And then my tight end winner is Cade Otton. To me, Cade Otton is going to be a top 5 tight end rest of the way, especially if Mike Evans does not come back on schedule. So Cade Otton, the next couple weeks where they're waiting for Evans to get back, I think week 12 is the earliest he can get back. Cade Otton is just going to eat. And, if you picked him up on waivers, I mentioned him earlier this season as getting involved in one of my under 40% roster guys that you should pick up right around week 6, 7, that time frame of the season. And if you took advantage of that and you grabbed Otton, then you're really rolling right now, because Otton is locked in. He's getting a ton of targets, and he is, to me, I think if you've got, Sam Laporta on your team, and if you have the ability to acquire Cade Otton, I would trade Laporta to get him. I know it feels bad because you took Sam Laporta so high, but you want to go after these tight ends that are getting targets. And the fact that they did not trade for a receiver like a DK Metcalf that could have taken that role away from Cade Otton just means that he's going to be locked in even more rest of season. This is great news for the Cade Otton managers. So who are the losers from this trade deadline? We'll start with the quarterback. I think the biggest loser to me is Justin Fields. I think there was a world of possibility where Fields could have been traded to a team that needs a quarterback, like Las Vegas or, maybe Carolina. I'm not sure if there's a ton of teams that really necessarily could have made sense, but at the same time, if you've got, teams with quarterback problems, Tennessee, for example, maybe they take a flyer on Fields and try to get some value out of him before, he hits the free agent market soon. But that did not happen. So for those that own Fields, now he's going to be back up to Russell Wilson, and he's probably droppable. But if there was any saving grace that he could have been traded to the Raiders, and then maybe he could have been, just a fantasy machine that on a losing team, but fortunately did not happen for him. Losers at the running back position. So I'm going to include 2 guys here: Travis Etienne and Jonathan Brooks. So I'm going to start with Etienne. He was another guy that was mentioned in trade rumors because Jacksonville has a lot of problems, and maybe they try to ship off him to build around Tank Bigsby, but they did not do that. I think if Etienne had been traded to, let's say, a Dallas, then, now he becomes a very interesting player. He's obviously very talented, and he needs a team that can, have some other guys out there to take some of the pressure off of him and also have a more defined role. And I think the problem is that the Jags line was not good, and it created situations where he just couldn't even get past the line of scrimmage. He's more effective as a pass-catching running back anyway, and it was just, this has been a rough year for Etienne. So people that own him hoped he would have been traded, but it did not happen, and I think that you're just going to continue to see a mess with this Jaguars backfield rest of the season. But like I've said earlier, you can check this out in my previous video, I think Etienne is still a great buy candidate if you can put him on your bench and stash him, but this kind of limits his upside, the fact that he was not put in a new opportunity. And then Jonathan Brooks, there was rumors that Chuba Hubbard could have been traded, and Brooks is very much a wild card right now in that, he could be a huge sleeper. He comes in as a, first round running back and then just, takes over this backfield. Or he could do absolutely nothing because he's coming off of an injury and they're not a good team. They may not utilize him. So it's very dichotomous what could happen with Jonathan Brooks. And I think if Chuba was going to get traded, that would have really helped his stock. Now it's just a lot of question marks with him. So it's a little unfortunate for the Brooks managers. Losers at wide receivers. So Jalen, Waddle, and JSN for me. I'll start with Waddle. I think that there were rumors that Tyreek Hill could be traded. I personally did not see that happening because he's an elite receiver, and I think Miami knows that their only path to getting back to success is getting Tyreek Hill more involved. So, and Waddle, first round pick, maybe they could have shipped Tyreek Hill off and tried to build around Waddle in the same role. But the fact that that did not happen means that Waddle is still mired in this situation where he's probably the third option now after Achane. Just really not a good development for the owners of him, especially in Dynasty. And then JSN, I think with the rumors of DK Metcalf being traded, this could have put JSN in a position to really just take off based on, we saw what he did this past week against Los Angeles. But now Jackson Smith and Jigba is still in this second, third wide receiver on this team that is just going to be a little bit limited by his upside. Talented player, but just doesn't get a lot of opportunity. And then this one feels a little bit of a cop-out because this trade did not happen today, but my tight end loser is going to be Mark Andrews. And that is because with the integration of Diontae Johnson, I think this is just going to hurt the amount of touches that Mark Andrews is going to get. I think that, I'm not expecting Diontae Johnson to become a fantasy monster. I think his best situation would have been to stay in Carolina. But now, you've got Zay Flowers competing for touches. You've got Derrick Henry, who's, if he's not running the ball effectively, which is most of the time, then he's going to get some receptions too. You've got, Bateman is still there. You've got Diontae Johnson, and you've got Likely. So now you have Mark Andrews. What happens with him? And I think he's still going to be relevant in some games, but I think now we're going to see a little bit more of what we saw at the beginning of the season where there's games where he doesn't do anything. So it's not a good development for Mark Andrews based on what happened this NFL trade season. All right, well, that's all that I've got for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions about your rosters for this week, and we'll include you in the mailbag coming up this weekend. And let me know if you want to do a live video or if you want to do the pre-recorded ones like we've done in weeks past. Well, that's all that I've got. Hope you guys have a good night, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.